There are thousands of knives available for purchase right now online. And the issue is always that you're going to have to know you want it before you ever have it in hand. So how is someone to know whether this is a good idea or not? It doesn't matter what price you're talking about. There are some characteristics that you always want to be made aware of that will help you narrow down the field and make a better choice. And that's what we're going to talk about today. How you can make a better choice with knives, how you can become a really good shopper and find that diamond in the rough. Let's go ahead and get started. It is very important to note that all 5 of the criteria I'm going to give are equally important, but we're going to start from the back of the knife and we're going to work our way forward. That's the easiest way I can go about it, and I think that all of these aspects are important. Starting with this knife, which is a really good example of multiple things relating to this category, and that is handle geometry. Handle geometry is something you can determine very easily just by looking at the image, and there are certain things you want to be made aware of or want to look for. The first one is how many cutouts for your fingers are there. If there is more than one of them, you should not buy the knife unless you have put your hands on it and know for a fact that your fingers are going to fall into each of those grooves. If they don't, the knife will inevitably be very uncomfortable. You'll find yourself, and this is a great example, where the pointed area will end up right in the middle of your finger. And believe me when I say that is a whole lot less comfortable than it could otherwise be. If you have cutouts, make sure that it's not going to be something that will dig into your hand. This one only has a single cutout, but because the transition is incredibly abrupt, it actually causes a little bit of a problem. Where when you have something like this, where the transition is a lot less abrupt, you're more likely to have a universal fit. Something that will fit just about anyone. Same thing is true here. In fact, more so with the Honey Badger. I think they've nailed this perfectly. But still, because the cutout is there, when you choke up, it really locks you into that position. This is a very good example of that. Now, in addition to the cutout, the other thing you want to be looking at and looking for is the shape of the handle itself. Now, I'm not talking about the shape in this regard. You know, generally speaking, handles are pretty uniform unless they're doing something wildly weird. But the actual contouring of the handle is a really important thing to know, because a contoured handle is always better than an uncontoured handle. Always better than a flat handle, 100% of the time. 100% of the time, you want that curvature. So all of these are great examples of this. Curved handle here on the CJRB, curved handle here on the Honey Badger, curved handle on the Bellamy, the Lander 2, the Sluto, which is kind of an interesting, even more stout, proud version of this. And of course, one of my favorites, the Acree. You really see the contouring on that. And to go along with this contouring, it's not just that it's contoured, you also want to be aware of the edges themselves. A knife where the steel protrudes beyond the actual scales themselves can potentially find more hot spots, and it is pronounced than if the handle scales themselves go all the way over, or the liners themselves are inset underneath the contoured section. These are all things you can look at, and they're all important when determining if this is a good choice or maybe a less good one. Anything else, if it doesn't have a contoured handle, it needs to make up for in other aspects to be a really good pick. So the next category is a little bit more difficult to determine just based on seeing a picture on the internet. But it is an incredibly important one if you are using your knife and using your knife on a daily basis, and that is handle texture. So I have some examples of what I would consider pretty low texture, not really very grippy. Both of these budget knives, which in and of themselves are very, very good, still don't have a ton of texture. So if you're generally going to use these as work knives or knives that are going to be present when your hands are sweaty, wet, oily, whatever it happens to be, these might not be the best choice for that particular aspect. And it's because the texturing is more for looks than it is for actual grip. The only difficult part is when you look at these from the top, it's not immediately apparent that they are not very grippy. So you're gonna have to do a little bit more research, but they're just one example. Another situation where you might get into, but it's not immediately apparent that this is in fact grippy, is something like this. This is the Buck 110 Slim Select. It is made in America, around $35. And even though it might appear smooth, there actually is a micro texture on this plastic, which does offer some extra grip. Even the little cutouts here, they do an okay job. Not great, but there's something. They're a little bit something more. So this is kind of like a mid-range, along with the Honey Badger knives, which has this sort of honeycomb pattern. With this, there is raised surfaces which could grip, but because it's FRN specifically, as things cool, they start to soften on the edges. Now this makes the handles very comfortable, especially on the parts that you're squeezing like this, but on the actual handle frame itself, it doesn't mean it's as grippy as it could otherwise be. Now this knife, and we'll talk about later, makes up for it in other aspects, but that is an example of sort of like somewhere in the middle, where all 5 of these other knives have fantastic handle texture. Some are obvious, some are not. So starting at the budget range, the K-Bar Dozier, like this is a perfect example of what every knife handle should look like. You have really grippy crosshatch pattern, kind of like a gun stock. You have a space where the pocket clip rests so that doesn't rip up your pocket. And then it goes all the way to the edge except for the very edge where your hand is going to sit. So you get all of the benefits with your fingers touching the flat part of the handle without having this part dig into your palm when you're pressing hard. It is the perfect combination, is a great example of doing it exactly right. Another one is very similar to it, is the SRM 9201. Now this is only a $22 knife, and it has some of the coolest, best handle texture I've ever seen, and they even found a way to make it kind of like, you know, representing the company itself. I love this texture. It is super grippy, yet very comfortable because of the plastic that's flat on the edges, and still grips like a champ. Now this is a crossbar lock, it's reversible and pocket clip. Now it doesn't have a spot for the pocket clip to sit, so that's a little bit worse, but once again, you're getting excellent handle texture. Now the quintessential example of perfect handle texture on FRN has got to be this Spidey grip. I don't remember exactly what they call their handle texture, but basically you can see there's little flat edges that angle themselves towards the emblem, which means that if you're here, it wants to push you this way, and if you're on this side, it wants to push you that way. Everything goes towards this spot, and this spot is exactly where your pocket clip sits. So the Para 3 lightweight, or pretty much any of their handle scales that have FRN, are going to have this incredibly grippy texture that is going to be very, very functional. This is just phenomenal, one of the best out there. But they are not the kings of grip. The kings of grip, that goes to Cold Steel. Now, okay, maybe Emerson, but Emerson is not something everyone's going to be able to afford. Cold Steel is serious about grip on knives because, guess what? They are one of those companies that kind of support abusing knives past normal limits. One of my favorite examples of this is the Cold Steel Voyager, a pretty big knife, about 4-inch blade here. And the texture on this is so aggressive, it's going to be ripping up your pockets no problem unless you grind down some of it underneath the clip. But they don't really care because the point of this is to keep it from sliding out of your hands, and man, does this have a lot of grip. Generally speaking, the more crazy stuff you're doing with a knife, the more grip you want. Same thing is true with this Formax, although this is actually a much finer texture, once again contoured as well, and sort of on the edge. It's a little bit lower than the Voyager, but still very comfortable. And in fact, I would say more comfortable than what is present on the Voyager. But when it comes to FRN, use your eyes as best you can. And if you have a situation like with the Buck 110 Slim Select, see if you can find some reviews on it to help you out before the purchase, especially if you're going to spend a lot of money on the knife. Now, this is a $30 knife. It's probably worth the risk, but there are other options that you can see immediately just by looking at them. Now, let's talk about the other common materials like G10, titanium, aluminum, and so on. Now I'm going to run through the rest of the common handle materials as quickly as I can, just getting general overviews so you can understand what to expect from them. Starting with carbon fiber. Carbon fiber, unless it's got some insane milled texture, in general is going to be incredibly slippery. It's very pretty, but almost always very, very slick in almost any environment. Aluminum is very similar to carbon fiber, but in some cases can actually be more so. It is most essential that if you want a knife for work, that you get some kind of texture rather than just a plain anodization on an aluminum handle. They are definitely somewhat different depending on the brand and how they do their anodization, but aluminum without texture is very slippery, especially when wet. Now, titanium. Titanium, you're mostly going to see in expensive knives. There are some exceptions. This one is a $45 titanium frame lock in 14C, but it is very rare. But titanium can also be either slippery or grippy depending on the texture that you get. So thankfully, when it comes to titanium, what you see is usually what you get. Texture always trumps non-texture. And I think even from a visual look perspective, texture usually trumps not texture as well. So if you're going to buy one, and it's not just going to be for display or collection, consider getting one with texture. It's one of my biggest regrets when it came to getting the Quiet Carry Drift. I wish I had waited and gotten one with the crosshatch pattern because it is just so grippy. The other thing to look at, a lot of knives might have texture on one side, but not on the other, especially if they are frame locks. There are some exceptions, like with the Avere, which has milling on both sides. That's the added touch you're looking for, especially if you're spending a lot of money. Now, some of the other materials that you will encounter for sure are steel handles, and these are probably the slipperiest out there, especially without texture. They look great, but other than that, they are almost always suboptimal, both in weight and in feel. Just be aware of that. There is also wood handles, which may not initially appear to be something that would grip onto your hand, but as they get wet, they can actually get surprisingly sticky. So as far as grip is concerned, they're kind of in the middle ground, similar to micarta in how they work in hand. I have found that as my hands get sweaty, it's hot out, I'm gripping the hand, the knife hard, I find that wood actually holds up very, very well and actually feels pretty secure in hand, sort of in the middle ground. And then we have the two big ones. We have micarta and G10. And we'll start with micarta. Micarta, thankfully, is really apparent whether it's fine or smooth grain or if it's rough grain. You'll know right from the look of it based on the pictures whether it's one or the other, and maybe you'll see a review of it. Generally, if you see little pieces or little fiber sticking out, that's a good sign if you're looking for more grip. And I almost always recommend getting a knife that starts out grippy like this with micarta, and if you need to, take off the scales and you can actually smooth it out with 3000 grit machine paper and it will be even smoother. You can control that very easily. And some companies, like this one, God, I love this knife, it's a good one, have this little micro texture on top of everything else. Now you can see I've started to smooth this out from use. This is one of my favorites. I've definitely used it quite a bit. And because of that little extra texture and the fact that micarta in general is pretty grippy, whether it's wet, sweaty, or otherwise, it's a very good choice for all kinds of use. One caveat is that without having steel liners, micarta is pretty flexible. So you'll see knives like the Lander 2, they have steel liners, which makes them very strong and feel very secure on top of having that nice feel. Same thing is true with the Bellamy here. You could see the steel structure in there. And this kind of pattern, well, just looking at it, you can tell this is extra grippy. This, in fact, is so grippy, I actually might have to mill out. I wanted to go ahead and file down underneath the clip. For me, that is actually a really good starting point, and it's something I look for in knives because I like knowing that I can manipulate the knife without feeling like I will drop it, even if my hands are wet, sweaty, oily, you name it, okay? So that's what you're looking for when it comes to micarta. Now G10, probably the most common of all materials, this one's tough. This one is probably the toughest one because it's really difficult to tell if it's smooth, like this one. This is a very smooth G10, or if it's got some micro texture, like this one here. Now, same company, this one is significantly grippier than this. Both of these knives, by the way, 30 bucks. So you can find both smooth and coarse depending on what you want in almost any price range. Another great example, this is the Cormorant from Kaiser Knives. Very, very grippy on this texture. It wasn't immediately apparent until I got it, just how much so. Just like with the Bellamy, I'm probably gonna have to file underneath because it is that grippy. Not a problem, actually a great problem. And just like with this is a Demco, and I can tell you one thing's for sure, whether you're getting the FRN or the G10 or any material from Demco outside of the smooth handled version of the titanium, it's going to be grippy because he knows all about that and he does not want your hands to slip out when you're manipulating the lock. So take a look if you can at the texture up close. It makes a big difference, especially with G10, because the added fibers inside, they add a level of grip that you don't find in most other materials. That's kind of the overview. I hope this kind of helps you. This, of all the 5 that we're going to talk about, this one is going to be the most difficult to nail down. But as long as you're thinking about it, I think you'll do a lot better. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. This next category, which we're talking about specifically grip on the blade or jimping, seems to be a very strong indicator for how good the designer is and how good the blade will, like the knife will function overall. I found that the knives with the best jimping also happen to be some of the best knives. I don't know if that's just a fluke or what, but it does seem to be a very interesting observation. I definitely find a consistency with people who are particular about this category, and it seems to result in, well, very good knives. So to get started, let me tell you what I'm talking about specifically. Now you'll see jimping on knives, you know, on the back of the spine. That's okay and somewhat, you know, some people like it, but I will tell you, it's very overrated as far as the actual use of a knife. The grip on the hand is far more important than the little jimping here. And frankly, it's the security on the grip, not necessarily the security on the blade that has ever caused me an issue in anything I've ever done with a knife. Almost always. But when it comes to jimping on any sort of deployment mechanism, whether it's a flipper tab or otherwise, that is really, really important, especially if your hands are a little slippery or otherwise. Now, just because you have jimping on a blade, even good jimping, now this is very good style of jimping, does not mean that it's done correctly. Notice that the jimping stops here, when reality is the only place that actually matters to have jimping is actually right in the part that there is no jimping on this knife. So this is a Honey Badger knives and otherwise has phenomenal jimping, but for some reason doesn't have it on the point that actually matters, because that's where you can slip off. Same thing is kind of true with the larger jimping. It pretty much doesn't do anything if it's not sharp enough to grip on your fingers. And then of course there are knives with no jimping at all. And these they have a variety of different prices. Now I'm picking on the Avere specifically because I know in the future iteration he's adding jimping. but it's just a feature that should exist on every flipper without exception, and there's literally no excuse for not having it. So keep an eye out for it. It's an important thing to know. And some companies have it no matter what on every single knife. Civivi is one of those companies. Notice that the jimping goes all the way around the corner and is decently aggressive on this particular knife. It's better when it's more aggressive, but still not bad. Now, ideally what you want is you want it to be aggressive in this direction, but then rounded on the sides. And that will mean it won't catch on anything, but still always grab your finger. I'll show you some good examples of it throughout this group right here, including one of my favorite overall examples. Look closely at a shark lock and you'll see how sharp those teeth are on this shark. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. That might seem like a downside, but the reality is it's incredibly important to the deployment of this blade. They thought this through. They have very aggressive, very sharp jimping, which is exactly what you want in anything where safety is concerned. And that is absolutely the case. When you put your finger here, it locks it like solid. Now this jimping, less important. Less important. It's not bad. This one actually isn't bad because it's somewhat sharp and it's close together, so it's not too painful. But the most important part is right there. That's really where it matters. And there's another place that it matters. When we get to it, we'll talk about it, is underneath potentially where you can grip the knife. Actually, you know what? We'll talk about it now. A great example of it is this right here on the Baby Banter. Not only does it have some of the best jimping on the back, this is the perfect type because it's close together and won't let your finger go forward or back, but it also has it on the finger choil so you don't slide forward when you're using the knife. These are not necessary features, but they are clear indicators to me when a knife has been thought through to a high level, and that usually results in a better knife overall. Same thing true with the Honey Badger, by the way. They have really gone overboard with the jimping in there, and I love it. Same thing is true here and the back here. Other than not putting it right there on the tip, a Honey Badger is one of the best when it comes to that, just on the grip, and even has that really fine serrated back section on top of it. So good example outside of the flipper tab. We talked about the AD 20.5. There's also just the ability to just have some sort of grip that sticks out, some sort of hook. This is a good example of that, but I'm always looking for good jimping on a knife. The Bellamy, one of my absolute favorites. This thing has jimpings galore, and they're very sharp in the center, but yet you see how the edge has been rounded on the sides so that it doesn't catch. The perfect amount for a front flipper, allowing me to do some pretty cool stuff outside of what you would normally be able to do just because of how much grip there is. That is something I'm looking for to help me determine whether this is just an okay knife or a really, really good one. And then of course, probably my favorite, probably the best one on the table, you have these really aggressive serrations, and because of the crown spine, it's curved, so it's very sharp in the middle, very soft on the edges, and makes for a perfect front flipping experience, like one of the best. And this is only a $40 knife with a titanium pocket clip and a 3.7-inch blade. You're gonna find these diamonds in the rough, and it's weirdly connected to how the details are presented. I think that's what I'm trying to get at with this. Remember I said bad texture here? Well, that comes in a bunch of different materials, including G10, but you know, not much attention was put on the jimping at all for this flipper tab. Thankfully, the geometry for it being so sharp in the corner means it doesn't really matter. Even if this is smooth, it would flip no problem. And then you see things like the Cormorant. Look at how nicely done the jimping is. All the way around the corners, on all sides, just great. And the jimping goes all the way out on this knife. Very, very cool. So there's plenty of places to put your fingers and you have no issues. One of the classics, Gotta love Spyderco. They put jimping down here to keep you from sliding up on the blade, jimping on the back to keep you from pushing over the top, and man, do they keep it sharp. Yes. When it comes to needing a knife that you don't want to slip around on, Spyderco knows what they're doing. And same thing with the flipper tab here, kind of like this one. They make up for it by having the sharp edge right at the very end so you can catch it and then pull it. Keep an eye on the jimping, specifically on the flipper tabs, and look at the rest of the knife as well. If there's a forward finger choil, see if there's jimping there, like on the Honey Badger. These are companies that pay a little bit more attention, and the designers are clearly taking their time to do all the small details. They're not necessary, but they are a pretty good indicator that a company is taking things seriously. Now, if you're more than just someone looking for a work knife and you're gonna use the same knife all the time and you really love the category, you love knives in general, well, you might wanna find a knife that deploys more than one way for enjoyment's sake. I know that sounds weird and not everyone will understand it, but as you go, I forgot a very important one. As you go through it and as you continue to expand your collection, you're gonna find that the way you manipulate your knife is part of your enjoyment. Now, all three of these up top, they have one way to open them. They're just flipper tabs, right? They're back flippers or a front flipper, right? Two different methods, basically one way in order to manipulate them. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's more interesting knives out there that can do a lot more. So an example, just having a cutout means not only can you flick it with your thumb like so, but you can also do the Spidey flick with your middle finger. So it just adds a little bit more of something to the knife. When you have a crossbar lock, not only can you just manipulate it like so, you can thumb flick the thing, and if you're really good, you can get your thumb, your middle finger behind that little thumb stud and you can reverse flick the knife too. But even if it's not that, you have the ability to just manipulate it with the lock itself. Another great lock for manipulation, but still very strong. So crossbar lock is a good overall choice, and you can find them, as I said, for as little as $22 and sometimes even cheaper than that. The combination of a milled pocket and a back flipper, actually this was another good example of really, really good jimping on a flipper tab, means that not only can you open it that way, but you can thumb flick it and you can reverse flick the knife. Although this has got really good detent. There you go. Very fun. Flipper and thumb stud. Flipper, but this has what we call a fuller. Now a fuller can be used just like a cutout, and you can actually reverse flick the knife or even thumb flick it if you're really good. I have not all knives are easy to do like this, and this is a 4.2 inch blade, something like that. It's a little bit more difficult. A little bit more fun, just adding that fuller. And there's a $30 knife that has that combination too. So this can be reverse flicked, and actually I think it's a little bit easier than the other one. Woo, that's nice. Very fun, right? Honey Badger, cutout, flipper tab, plenty of ways to open it, right? This one has got all the things. This is the Bellamy. So this has got a front flipper, pull it over the top if you want to, back flipper, and it's got a fuller. So that's like too much, right? Almost too much. The same thing is true with the Cormorant. Back flipper, front flipper, thumb deployment. If you like to manipulate a knife, know how many ways you can open the knife, because likely this is going to be your fidget toy, not just a functional tool. And then of course you have the Spyderco compression lock, which in and of itself is a very fun and enjoyable lock. You can reverse flick the thing, you can thumb flick it. Another great knife design with many different ways to manipulate it. And then of course, we got to end on the Demco Shark Lock, because not only does it have a bazillion ways to manipulate it, it has another intangible, which you probably can't see on, a digital image, but also has great sound. So if you're using them also kind of as your fidget toy, and I do, this might also be important to you. But combining that, the ability to flick it out with this, I have the reverse flick with the cutout, I got the thumb studs. This has a ton of different ways to deploy it. I mean, you can, yeah, it's a fun knife, not just a good knife. And yes, I know that sounds silly to a lot of people, but it's something to be aware of. How many ways can I deploy the knife? Does that matter to me? If it is yes, target the right knives. Do a little research, and you'll probably find that they've been reviewed, and they can tell you how strong the D10 is, how easy it is to deploy it in various different methods, but be aware of it. It's something you want to know. Now, if there's one category you're going to spend a lot of time researching, understanding, testing, using, it's going to be cutting geometry. Your blade's cutting geometry is what makes or breaks a knife, right? It's what is going to make it good or bad at various different cutting tasks. Knowing what geometry you're looking for is incredibly important. Now, I don't have a lot of time to go through each and every various different cutting geometry that exists. I'm going to talk about just some general designs and so on that I think would be helpful. So, the first one is how rough are you going to be with your blade? Generally speaking, the more rough you're being with your knife, the more you want to get to a thick area behind the edge of the blade. So great examples of this, the 80-20.5 has a very thick grind, and so it's going to be really tough. The same thing is true with things like the 4 Max Scout, the Cold Steel Voyager in many of its varieties, not including the full flat grind version. Saber ground blades, or ones that have a flat grind that do not go very tall, which is this distance here, they're going to have a more stout approach. Now, of course, there's also the blade shape itself. This is what they call a shark's foot. It's like a sheep's foot. It's kind of the same idea, slight curvature, but this is going to be good for draw cutting if that's the purpose you're looking for. Or you're going to want something with a curve to it. I would recommend, if you're looking for a general use knife that can do a lot of things at once, not just one task, and you know you're doing that over and over again, but general use, I would look for a drop point blade, something that has some amount of curvature, potentially a center point to the center of the handle, and just something, it's going to be simple. It's going to be decent at draw cutting, but it's also going to do a lot of other tasks as well, keeping your hand out of the way as you rotate because the curve still touches whatever surface you have. Where with this, if I rotate my hand up, the only part that's coming in contact is the last little bit of the blade. So if you are doing a lot of utility style tasks where you're draw cutting things, you probably would need a knife like this one. But if you're not, a more general use shape might make a little bit more sense. Now, as far as grinds are concerned, the remaining two that we really need to talk about are flat grinds and hollow grinds. Well, you know what? Start with the hollow grind. The hollow grind has gotten a really bad rap over the years because a lot of times people think about that gas station knife that has such a bad hollow grind that it's actually thicker at the edge than it is like in the middle here. You've seen those before where they actually come back out to a thicker part because the hollow is just so badly positioned. That's what most people think a hollow grind should be. But in reality, a hollow grind that is done well is the most slicey of all edges that you'll get. I mean, when you talk about cutting performance, hollow grind is the way. It is super duper slicey. One of the quintessential examples of this, the Buck 110 or 112. This one was even designed with no choil in the sharpening in mind, specifically for use in the outdoors and use in skinning, so this doesn't catch any of your material as you're going through. A hollow grind is incredibly slicey. If you are doing soft materials, right, primarily soft materials, a hollow grind is a really, really good choice if it's a good quality blade. All of these that you're seeing here that are hollow ground, which is the Acree, one of my absolute favorites. We've talked about this a lot with the contoured handles, less than 40 bucks, amazing action. Just, yeah, this is a good one. And they've done it properly. You can feel right behind it. It is the thinnest point. Very, very nice. The Bellamy, another one of my favorites, currently discontinued, but still good. The Cormorant, available in multiple varieties right now, hollow ground, done very, very well. You can't go wrong if you are using it for sliciness. But let's say you only wanted just one, and you had to pick between, I don't know, a hollow grind, a full flat, or some sort of saber or flat grind, but doesn't go all the way up. Start in the middle. The middle ground here, and it's going to be true for most anyone, is going to be just a full flat grind. A full flat grind is not going to be perfect at everything. It's not going to be as slicey as a hollow grind. It's not going to be as tough as a saber. It's not going to be specific to woodcraft like a Scandi grind, which we're not even going to talk about on this list. But it kind of gives you a little bit of everything. That's why I think so many people have fallen in love with Spyderco in general, because almost all of their knives are usable in any situation, whether you're using it for woodcraft, you're using it for slicing up meat, whatever it is. They kind of have the gambit. They have kind of a little bit of everything. And I think that's what the flat grind will give you. Honey Badger did kind of the same thing, only they kept their blade a little bit more stout towards the tip because of the geometry. And it is a very, very versatile, hard-working knife. Same thing here. You can't go wrong with a flat grind. The one thing you want to be made aware of, and this is where you can start to have a little bit of variance, even making it almost as good as a hollow grind, is the thickness of the blade. So this is the cubit, and you can see, look at how thin that blade is. So that is just a statistic that you can read, but become aware of the thickness of the blade, the grind of the blade, and that will tell you where this sits on the scale of hard use versus sliciness. I know this is a lot of information. The goal of this is to have you spending more time picking the right tools and less time having to return the items that you definitely don't want. So as a bonus, I know we're already having a long video. I'm going to talk about 5 knives that are budget centric, under $50, that hit most of the criteria that I've talked about. So using this approach, these 5 knives all fall within the 2 thumbs up category. We have the K-Bar Dozier. Yes, it's in AUS-8, but hollow ground, really tough, excellent texture, all the things we want, right? The SRM 9201, excellent texture, great full flat grind, plenty of space for the sharpening choil, multiple ways to manipulate it, reversible clip, you get the idea. The Honey Badger knives, all of the Honey Badger knives just pretty much hit everything except for, as I said, a little bit more jimping right here at the tip and just maybe slightly different texture on the handle. Other than that, Honey Badger knives are some of the best out there overall to do any sort of tasks that you need with a cutting edge. This one from Migron, I don't know why, but I can't remember the name off the top of my head. G10 handle scales, D2 blade steel, just incredible fit and finish, multiple forms of deployment, and $30. And then of course, the Acrete. Now it does have only one way to deploy it, and it has a relatively smooth G10 handle. But my goodness, is this not one of my all-time favorite budget knives in existence? And I just adore its cutting capability with that hollow grind. A lot of these knives have some of the characteristics that I've discussed here. And hopefully now that you know, you'll start seeing these characteristics in knives that you're looking at from here on in. I hope that was helpful. As always, thank you guys so much for your time, and we'll talk again soon.